The candle had barely burnt an inch when Aldric Voss, Duke of Cerveth, stepped into the cold of his sister's empty chamber and felt the world tilt beneath him. Her bed was untouched, her slippers still crossed neatly by the door. But Seraphine was gone, just gone, as if the dark had swallowed her whole. He didn't shout, didn't call for the servants. Aldric stood very still, the way a man stands when he already suspects that screaming will solve nothing, that whatever took his sister moved quietly, and with purpose. And then his eyes fell on something on the windowsill, something that made his blood run cold, because he had seen that same marking once before, on his mother's wrist, on the night she wept and told him, told no one else, that she had made a bargain she could never take back. His mother had died with that secret, and now it had come for Seraphine. There was only one man in all of England who could help him trace it. One man who knew the old, buried world his mother had once been part of. One man Aldric had sworn on his father's grave he would never speak to again. Cressian Wolfe. What did his mother sell? And to whom? And what exactly does Cressian Wolfe want in return for helping the Duke? If you want to find out whether Aldric can save his sister before whoever took her comes back for more, subscribe right now and hit that bell, because this story is only just beginning, and I promise you, the next part will leave you breathless.
Aldric had not slept. He stood at the window of his study, still in the same coat he had worn the night before, watching the grey Cerveth dawn bleed slowly into the sky above the moors. The house behind him was quiet in the way that hurt. Not the quiet of a sleeping household, but the quiet of one that had been interrupted and had not yet found its footing again. Seraphine's chamber had been searched twice over. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pendwick, had gone through every drawer, every wardrobe, every corner where a note or a dropped ribbon might tell them something. There was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no window forced open, just the absence of a girl who had gone to bed at 9, and simply was not there when the morning came. Aldric pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed. He was 31 years old, and he had managed the Cerveth estate since he was 19, since the year his father's heart gave out in the East Wing and left him holding a dukedom, a mountain of debt, and a mother who had not been entirely herself since, long before that. He had learned early how to keep his face smooth and his voice steady. He had learned how to walk into a room and make people believe everything was, in order even when nothing was. It was a kind of armour he had built piece by piece, and he wore it well. But Seraphine was gone, and the armour felt very thin this morning. She was 23, small-boned and quick-witted, with their mother's dark eyes, and a laugh that always seemed slightly too large for whatever room she was in. She had been at Cerveth for the past 3 weeks, recovering from a mild fever that had kept her from the season's last round of assemblies. She had complained about it bitterly. Seraphine was not a girl who liked being still, and Aldric had teased her gently, told her the assemblies would go on without her and survive the loss. She had thrown a cushion at him. That had been 4 days ago. He turned away from the window and looked at his desk. The marking he had seen on the windowsill pressed into the soft wood of the sill itself, faint but deliberate, like something branded there and then smoothed over, had been a small thing. 2 circles, one inside the other, with a single line crossing both. He had sketched it from memory on a piece of paper, and then stood staring at his own drawing for a very long time. He had seen it before. He was certain of it. The certainty sat in him the way old memories do. Not sharp, not fully formed, but deep, rooted somewhere behind conscious thought. His mother. Isolde Voss had been a complicated woman. Beautiful in a way that never softened with age, and quietly frightening in a way that most people mistook for dignity. She had come to his father already carrying something unspoken, some old weight that she had arranged herself around so long that it had simply become part of her shape. Aldric had grown up understanding, without being told, that there were parts of his mother's life that did not belong to the family. Places in her she did not open, questions she would look through rather than answer. She had died 4 years ago in her sleep. Peacefully, the physician had said, and Aldric had stood at her graveside in the January cold and felt something he could not quite name. Grief, yes, but also a kind of incompleteness, as if she had left mid-sentence. Now he thought of what she had told him once, late at night, when he was perhaps 17, and she had been sitting at her dressing table with her hair down and her face bare and her guard, just barely, lowered. He had come to her room to ask something trivial, something he no longer remembered, and she had looked at his reflection in the mirror and said, in a voice that held no particular emotion, "There are debts, Aldric, that outlive the people who made them." She had not explained. He had not asked. He had been 17, and had understood only enough to know that he was not meant to push. He was pushing now. He crossed to the fireplace where a low fire had been burning since before dawn. Someone had seen to it, Fenwick probably, his steward, who had the useful quality of anticipating what was needed without being asked. Aldric picked up the sketched paper from the mantel where he had left it and looked at the 2 circles and the crossing line. Fenwick appeared in the doorway, at that moment as if summoned. He was a thin, careful man of about 50, with greying temples, and the expression of someone who had long ago accepted that his employer's world was rarely simple. He had served the Cerveth household for over 2 decades. He had known Aldric's father. He had, Aldric suspected, known certain things about his mother that had never been written down anywhere. "Your Grace," Fenwick said, and then stopped, because Aldric held up the paper. The steward looked at it from across the room. Something moved through his face, quickly, quietly, and then it was gone. "You recognize it," Aldric said. It was not a question. Fenwick came into the room and closed the door behind him, with the careful click of a man choosing his next words with the same deliberateness. He crossed the floor, took the paper, and studied it for a moment longer than was necessary. "It was on her windowsill," Aldric said, "pressed into the wood." "Yes," Fenwick said quietly. "I know what it is. Then tell me." Fenwick set the paper down on the desk and was still for a moment, and Aldric watched him make some private, internal decision, watched the balance tip. "It is a seal," the steward said. "Not a family crest. Not a society. Something older than that, and less visible. Your mother knew it because she had been connected, in her youth, to certain people who operated beneath the usual world. People with arrangements that did not pass through solicitors or courts." He paused. "She left that world when she married your father, or she believed she had. And this marking being in Seraphine's room means what, precisely?" Fenwick looked at him steadily. "It means, Your Grace, that whoever took Lady Seraphine is not a common criminal. It means they are making a point. To you, or to her memory." He did not say your mother's memory. But the space where the words should have been was perfectly clear, and it means they have reached considerably further than this house. This sort of mark is a message. They are not hiding from you. They want you to follow. The fire crackled. Outside, a rook called once, from somewhere on the grounds, and then went quiet. Aldric stood very still. They wanted him to follow. Into what? Into where? Into which buried world his mother had once moved through and never spoken of? He did not yet know. But beneath the cold and the sleeplessness and the tight, disciplined fear that he had been holding in check since the moment he had seen Seraphine's empty room, something else was rising. Something less civilized than reason. He had kept this house in order for 12 years. He had paid his father's debts and managed the land and sat through 100 tedious dinners and made every correct, careful, measured decision a duke was supposed to make. He had given up more than anyone knew to be what this family needed him to be, and something had walked into his house in the dark and taken his sister. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. "Send no word to anyone," he said. "Not the magistrate, not the neighbours, no one." Fenwick nodded, unsurprised. "And Cressian Wolfe," Aldric said, and even saying the name felt like pressing a thumb against a bruise. "Where is he now?" A short pause. "London, Your Grace. Southwark, by last account, though his whereabouts tend to be approximate." Aldric looked at the fire one last moment. He thought of Seraphine, her laugh that was too large for rooms, the cushion she had thrown at him 4 days ago. "Have the carriage ready within the hour." Fenwick turned to go. At the door, he stopped without being asked, as if he had known there would be something else. "What was she like?" Aldric said quietly. "My mother, before she married my father. What do you know that you never told me?" The steward's hand rested on the doorframe. "Enough," he said, "that I always hoped you would never need to ask." And then he was gone, and Aldric stood alone in the firelight, with 12 years of careful control sitting very lightly on him now, and London waiting, and a name in his pocket that tasted like the worst kind of last resort. The road to London was punishing. Aldric sat inside the carriage with his back straight and his hands flat on his knees, watching the Cerveth grounds disappear through the window as the horses pulled them south. The moors gave way to hedgerows to muddy road to the slow creep of villagers waking into morning. He did not sleep, he did not try. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the empty bed, the crossed slippers, the faint brand pressed into the soft wood of the windowsill, like a signature left by something patient and deliberate. He thought about his mother. Not the version of her he had grown up beside. The contained, beautiful, slightly unreachable woman who sat at the head of the table and managed the household with quiet authority. But the version Fenwick had gestured at without fully naming. The version that existed before Cerveth, before his father, before the life she had constructed so carefully around whatever she was leaving behind. He had never thought to wonder, when she was alive, what she had been running from. He had taken her silences for temperament, her distance for dignity. He had been a child, and then a young man, and then a man with too much on his hands to look closely at anything that was not immediately on fire. He was looking now. The carriage hit a rut and jolted hard. He caught the door handle without thinking and straightened again, and somewhere in the jolt, something loosened in him slightly. Some tightly held thing that had been keeping him upright since the night before. He let himself feel it for one moment. The fear. Not the controlled, managed version he had been carrying in his chest like a stone, but the real thing, the animal, wordless terror of someone who loves a person and cannot find them. Seraphine. Her dark eyes and her too large laugh. And the particular way she tilted her head when she was about to say something that would either delight or embarrass everyone in the room. He pulled it back in, locked it down. There would be time to fall apart when she was home. They reached the edges of London by early afternoon, and the city swallowed them the way it always did. Without ceremony, without softening. The noise came first, then the smell, then the press of bodies and horses and commerce that never seemed to pause regardless of what was happening to any individual person within it. Aldric had always found London faintly hostile. He came when he had to, stayed as briefly as he could, and returned to Cerveth with the particular relief of a man who knows where he belongs. Today the city felt worse than usual. It felt indifferent in a way that made his jaw tighten. Southwark was south of the river, and the carriage crossed London Bridge with the slow patience of something too large and too fine for the crowds pushing around it. The neighbourhood that opened up on the far side was not one Aldric knew well. He knew its reputation. Most people of his standing knew it only as a place to be named with mild distaste at dinner tables. Narrow streets, old money gone to seed, the kind of establishments that did not advertise what they were. Cressian Wolfe had chosen it deliberately. Aldric suspected. The man had always had a gift for situating himself somewhere between visibility and shadow. He had the address from Fenwick's network. A contact of a contact passed through two careful intermediaries, which was apparently the only way anyone ever located Wolfe, when Wolfe had not decided to be located himself. It led them to a street that was not quite as narrow as it looked, and not quite as quiet as it pretended, to a building that from the outside announced nothing except age and mild disrepair. Aldric stepped out of the carriage, told his driver to wait, and stood on the uneven cobblestones for a moment, looking up at it. He had not seen Cressian Wolfe in 6 years. The last time had been at his father's memorial, which Wolfe had not been invited to, and had attended anyway, appearing at the edge of the grounds like something the property had grown there on its own. Aldric had seen him across the lawn and felt simultaneously unsurprised and furious. They had spoken briefly, privately, and with the particular tight-lipped civility of two people who have a great deal to say to each other and have agreed, wordlessly, that this is not the moment. Aldric had told him to leave. Wolfe had inclined his head in something that was technically a bow and had gone, and Aldric had watched him walk away and told himself he was glad. He had not been entirely glad. He went inside. The interior of the building was better than the exterior had implied. Not luxurious, but deliberate. A hallway, a staircase, the low murmur of something happening in a back room. A young woman appeared from a doorway and looked at him with a calm assessment of someone, trained to evaluate arrivals quickly and accurately. Aldric gave his name. She disappeared without a word. He waited. He was not accustomed to waiting. He stood in the hallway with his hat in his hand, and his coat still carrying the cold of the road, and he made himself stand still, because moving would betray too much, and he had not come here to be readable. Then a door at the far end of the hall opened, and Cressian Wolfe walked through it. 6 years had not diminished him. That was Aldric's first thought, immediate and unwanted. Wolfe was perhaps 2 years older than him. 33, 34. Lean in the way of someone who moved constantly and ate irregularly, with dark hair that was slightly too long for fashion and eyes of an unusual pale grey, that had always had the unsettling quality of seeing more than they let on. He was not dressed like a gentleman, and not dressed like the other thing he was either. Something in between, which had always been precisely the point. He stopped in the middle of the hallway and looked at Aldric, and his expression was not surprised. Of course it was not surprised. Nothing surprised Cressian Wolfe, or if it did, no one would ever know. "Carveth," he said. His voice was the same, low, unhurried, faintly amused by things that were not remotely amusing. "Wolfe," Aldric said. A pause stretched between them, like a thing with some weight to it. "You look terrible," Wolfe said pleasantly. "When did you last sleep?" "Seraphine has been taken," Aldric said, because he had not come here for conversation. Something shifted in Wolfe's face, quickly, but Aldric was watching for it, and he saw it. A tightening around the eyes. Not surprise precisely, something closer to recognition. "Come in," Wolfe said. The room behind the door was small and surprisingly ordered. Books along one wall, maps pinned with careful precision to another. A table with papers that Wolfe moved aside, without explanation, as they entered. He did not offer tea or a chair or any of the usual niceties which Aldric found he was grateful for. He sat anyway, uninvited, because his body had decided that the road and the sleeplessness were presenting their bill, and Wolfe settled across from him with his arms folded and his pale eyes level. Aldric told him everything: the empty room, the slippers, the marking on the sill. Fenwick's half-explanation about a world beneath the usual world, about seals and old arrangements, and his mother's buried past. He laid it out without ornamentation, the way he would present a problem that needed solving, and he watched Wolfe's face throughout and learned almost nothing from it. When he finished, Wolfe was quiet for a moment. "The mark," he said. "2 circles inside the other, single line crossing both. Yes, that's the seal of a group that hasn't moved openly in over a decade." He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing something historical and distant, rather than something that had been in Aldric's house the night before. "They call themselves the Veiled Compact. They operate through debt, old debts, generational debts, arrangements made between families and powerful intermediaries, binding in ways that courts don't recognize, but that the people involved understand perfectly well. Your mother—" He stopped. "Go on," Aldric said very evenly. Wolfe looked at him with those pale eyes and seemed to make a decision. "Your mother made an arrangement with them before she married your father. I don't know the full terms. I know she made it because she was desperate. She was 20 years old and her family had nothing, and someone offered her a way out." A pause. "She paid what she owed, as far as I understood it. But these people calculate interest in ways that are not always clear at the time of borrowing. And when they decide the account has reopened, they don't knock at the front door." The room was very quiet. "How do you know any of this?" Aldric said. It came out almost steady. Wolfe uncrossed his arms and set his hands on the table. "Because I have been watching the compact for 3 years. Because 2 other families have lost someone in the past 18 months. A younger son, a daughter, and no one connected them because no one knew to look at the same mark in each case." He paused again. "And because your mother came to me 4 months before she died and told me she was frightened. The words landed on Aldric like something physical. His mother had been frightened. His contained, unreachable, carefully controlled mother had gone to Cressian Wolfe, a man she had met twice, perhaps 3 times, and told him she was frightened. She had not told Aldric. She had not told anyone in the family. She had gone to this man, in some room somewhere, and opened enough to admit fear, and she had never said a word to her own son. He did not let it show. He pressed it down into the same place where he had put the terror about Seraphine and the grief about his mother, and the 12 years of holding everything together, and he met Wolfe's gaze across the table and kept his voice perfectly flat. What did she tell you? That she had received a message. That they were reminding her the debt had not been settled to their satisfaction. That she feared it would fall to her children. Wolfe's voice was careful now. It measured in a way that told Aldric he was being given something real. She asked me to keep watch. She didn't want you involved. She said you had already carried enough. Aldric stood up. He did not mean to. His body simply moved, some refusal to absorb that particular truth while sitting still. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room and breathed through his nose and looked at the street below where his carriage waited, and the ordinary world moved past in complete ignorance of any of this. She had known. She had been afraid for them, and she had protected him from knowing it, and then she had died and left him, without the map, without the warning, without anything, except a silence he had always mistaken for distance. He turned back around. "I need your help," he said. The words cost him something. He knew Wolfe could see that, and he no longer had enough energy to care. "I don't know this world. I don't know how to move through it or who to press or how to find her. You do. A beat. Name your terms." Wolfe looked at him for a long moment, and in his pale grey eyes there was something that might, in another man, have been called sorrow, or something adjacent to it, something that knew more than it was saying and had known it for some time. "My terms," Wolfe said slowly, "are that you follow my lead without argument. That you ask me no questions about my methods unless you are truly prepared for the answers, and that when this is over, you sit down and let me tell you everything your mother told me." He held Aldric's gaze, all of it, not the comfortable version. Aldric said nothing for a moment. Outside, a horse clattered over the cobblestones. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opened and closed. "Agreed," Aldric said, and somewhere in the quiet that followed that single word, something shifted. Some door opened between them that had been closed for 6 years, and behind it was not comfort, not ease, not anything simple at all. Just the beginning of something that neither of them could yet see the shape of, moving forward into a city that held his sister somewhere in its enormous indifferent dark. Wolfe stood. "Then we leave tonight," he said, "and Cerveth. Whatever you think you know about your family, let it go. It will only slow you down." They left at nightfall. Wolfe moved through London the way water moves through cracks, finding the path of least resistance, slipping through gaps that Aldric would not have noticed existed. He did not take the main roads. He did not explain where they were going until they were nearly there. And even then he offered only enough to keep Aldric moving forward. It should have been infuriating. Aldric found, to his own mild surprise, that it was not. There was something clarifying about following someone who knew exactly what they were doing, when you were operating at the edge of your own competence and knew it. They went on foot. Aldric had sent his carriage, back to the inn where his driver was lodged, stripped his coat of anything that announced his rank. The embossed buttons, the family pin at his lapel, and followed Wolfe into the city's underbelly with the particular feeling of a man stepping off solid ground into water of unknown depth. Southwark gave way to Bermondsey. The streets narrowed, and the lamps thinned, and the sounds changed. Less commerce, more human noise, voices behind walls, the occasional sharp sound that could have been laughter or something else. Wolfe walked slightly ahead, hands loose at his sides, scanning without appearing to scan. He wore his awareness of the environment the way other men wore their coats. Naturally, without effort, as though he had been born with it already on. Aldric watched him and thought about what he had said in that room, about his mother going to him 4 months before she died, about her being frightened. He had been turning it over since they left, pressing it the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, unable to leave it alone, unable to make it stop hurting. His mother had been afraid and had chosen this man to confide in, a man she barely knew, rather than her own son. He understood the instinct to protect. He had spent 12 years doing it himself, managing what the household knew, filtering what reached Seraphine, keeping the full weight of things off people who could not carry it. He understood the arithmetic of protection, but understanding it did not stop it from landing like an accusation. Wolfe stopped in front of a building that looked from the outside like a cookshop, low windows, warm light, the smell of something charred drifting through the door. He looked at Aldric briefly. "In here, you are not a duke," he said. "You have no title, no estate, no history. If anyone asks, you are a solicitor's clerk. You are with me. You say as little as possible." "I am capable of discretion," Aldric said. "I know. I'm reminding you, anyway, because the instinct to command tends to override discretion when a man is frightened for someone he loves." He said it without cruelty, as a simple observation, and held the door open. Inside, it was warm and dim and considerably more populated than the hour warranted. Low tables, low voices, men and a few women arranged in configurations that suggested ongoing business of various kinds. No one looked up when they entered, which was itself a kind of message. This was a place where not looking up was the done thing. Wolfe led them to a table near the back wall, angled so both could see the room, and sat with the easy unhurriedness of someone expected. A man appeared almost immediately. Not a server. He had the posture of someone who expected to be listened to. Compact and weathered, with a jagged scar running from below his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He looked at Wolfe first, then at Aldric, with the specific, measuring quality of a man who had learned to assess strangers quickly because his life had occasionally depended on it. "Marvell," Wolfe said. "Sit down." His name was Orin Marvell, and he was, Wolfe had explained briefly on the walk over, one of perhaps 4 people in London who tracked the movements of the Veiled Compact with any reliability. He was not a good man in any conventional sense. He was, however, a precise one, which was more useful. Marvell sat. He looked at Aldric again. "Who is the fine one?" "With me," Wolfe said simply. Marvell did not look entirely satisfied with this, but appeared to accept it as the terms. He leaned forward on his elbows. "You're asking about the girl." Aldric went very still. Wolfe's expression did not change. "What girl? Come on." Marvell's voice was low, almost bored. "Young woman, dark hair, quality clothes. Someone brought her through the Callow Street passage 2 nights ago." I have 3 people who saw the transit and 2 who recognized the escorts. He glanced at Aldric again, something shifting in his expression. Not sympathy, exactly, but an acknowledgement. She was alive and unharmed when she passed through. Sedated, most like, but moving on her own feet. The breath Aldric released was not quiet. He pressed his fist briefly against the table, and then opened his hand flat and made himself sit still. Alive. She had been alive 2 nights ago. Where were they taking her? Wolfe said. That's the question, isn't it? Marvell leaned back. The compact doesn't keep people in the city. Too visible, too many variables. They have a property. Properties, plural, most likely, but one that keeps coming up when they need somewhere contained and quiet. East of here, Essex direction. No one's pinned the exact location, but I have a rough corridor, and I have a name connected to the transit order. Give me the name. Marvell looked at him for a moment. It's going to cost you. It always does. What do you want? Information, Marvell said, about the Halverton job. You were there. I know you were there. I need to know what was in the second room. Something passed through Wolfe's face, so briefly that Aldric nearly missed it. A calculation, a weighing. Then it settled. I'll tell you what I can confirm, Wolfe said. The rest you'll have to source elsewhere. Marvell nodded once. The name is Galt. Piers Galt. He's not the head of anything. He's an instrument. He arranges logistics for the compact. Transit, housing, enforcement. Former military. No particular affiliation now, except money. He was seen coordinating the Callow Street movement personally, which means this one matters to them. This isn't a routine collection. A routine collection, Aldric said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, which was perhaps the only reason he did not say something that would have ended the conversation entirely. Marvell looked at him with those flat, assessing eyes. The compact takes people when debts are called. Usually they hold them until terms are negotiated and satisfied. Usually no harm comes, provided the family cooperates and pays what's asked. A pause. The fact that Galt himself managed this one suggests the debt being called is larger than usual, or older, or both. After Marvell left, Wolfe sat quietly for a moment, and Aldric sat across from him, with the noise of the room moving around them, and his chest feeling like something had taken up residence in it that was too large for the space. Say what you're thinking, Wolfe said. I'm thinking that my mother borrowed something she could not repay, and that whatever she borrowed it for, the interest has now been charged to Seraphine. His voice was even. His hands, flat on the table, were not entirely steady. I'm thinking that I have spent 12 years believing I understood the full extent of what this family carried. And I was wrong. I'm thinking he stopped. Go on. I'm thinking that if she were here I would not know whether to grieve her or be furious with her. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Both, he said. That's the answer. Both at the same time. It doesn't have to resolve. Aldric looked at him across the table. In the low warm light of the room, Wolfe looked, not less guarded, exactly, but differently guarded, as though the particular shield he kept between himself and the world was still there, but at a slightly different angle. You cared for her, Aldric said. My mother. Wolfe did not look away. She was an exceptional woman in an impossible situation who made decisions that I did not always agree with and that I understood completely. A beat. Yes. I cared for her. It should have felt threatening. Aldric examined it and found that it did not, or not in the way he would have predicted. It felt, instead, like being handed a piece of something he had not known was missing. His mother, real and complicated and frightened, reflected in someone else's careful words. "She told me to look after you," Wolfe said quietly. "If it ever came to this." "I don't need looking after," Aldric said immediately. "No." A pause. She knew that too. I think she meant something different. I think she meant, don't let him be alone in it. The fire in the grate nearby shifted and crackled. Around them the room continued its low business. Outside, London moved through its night indifferently, enormous and dark and full of people who would never know that a woman had been carried through a passage 2 nights ago, and that the man who should have protected her was sitting in a cookshop in Bermondsey learning, piece by piece, that the ground he had built his life on was not the ground he had believed it to be. They found lodgings for the night in a narrow building, 3 streets over, 2 rooms, no view, the sounds of the city seeping through the walls. Aldric did not sleep, but he lay down, which was a kind of concession to the body's demands, and he stared at the ceiling in the dark, and let himself think about what he knew and what he still did not. He knew Seraphine had been alive and moving 2 nights ago. He knew there was a man named Piers Gault who could be found and pressed. He knew the compact operated somewhere in Essex, and that finding the precise location would take time they might not have in unlimited supply. He knew that the debt was his mother's, and that it had been called with interest, and that whoever had calculated that interest had decided Seraphine was the currency. What he did not know was the size of the original debt, what his mother had needed so desperately at 20 years old, that she had bound herself, and apparently her children, to people like this. What had been so urgent, so catastrophic, that it had required the kind of arrangement that courts did not recognize, but that lasted decades. He thought about her at the dressing table, 19 years old, sitting across the room from his 17-year-old self, saying, "There are debts, Aldric, that outlive the people who made them." She had been telling him. In her way, at the angle she could manage, she had been trying to tell him. In the next room, he could hear Wolfe moving, quiet and restless, the sound of a man who also was not sleeping. He thought about what it meant that his mother had trusted him, that she had gone to this particular man, complicated, ungovernable, operating in the space between worlds, and told him she was afraid. Had she known something in him that others did not see? Had she recognized something? He thought, unwillingly, about the way Wolfe moved through this city, the way he held a room's attention without appearing to reach for it, the way he had looked at Aldric across that table in the cookshop, and said both, "That's the answer," both at the same time, without any of the usual social lubricant, without softening it into something easier to swallow. He had simply offered the truth, plainly, as if Aldric were capable of holding it. Very few people treated him as though he were capable of being told the truth plainly. He did not know what to do with that. In the morning they were both up before light, and Wolfe appeared in the narrow hall outside their rooms, already dressed, and carrying information he had obtained, from whom and how Aldric did not ask, about Piers Gault's most recent known location, a gaming establishment near the river, frequented on Thursday evenings, which tonight was, which meant they had a window. "We're not going to confront him," Wolfe said, as they went downstairs into the cold grey morning to watch him. "I want to know who he speaks to, in what order, and what he does after he leaves. Movement patterns are more honest than anything a man will tell you under pressure. And if he leads us to her, Then we will be very careful and very precise, and nothing will go wrong, Wolfe said, with the equanimity of a man who knew perfectly well that things went wrong and had made his peace with it. You don't believe that? No, but I've found it's better to behave as though I do until the moment it becomes obviously untrue. Saves a great deal of energy. He glanced sideways at Aldric. You did well last night at Marvell's. Aldric said nothing. I mean it. Men in your position, men who are accustomed to being the authority in every room, tend to override when they're frightened. You didn't. You let the conversation be what it needed to be. I had no choice. I don't know this world. You had every choice. Knowing you don't know something and allowing that to govern your behavior instead of your pride. That's not nothing. A pause. Most people don't manage it. They stepped out into the Bermondsey Street, and the city rose around them with its noise and its indifference and its thousand hidden seams, and Aldric walked beside the most unsettling ally he had ever made, and felt something unfamiliar stirring alongside the fear, and the grief, and the relentless, driving urgency. Not hope precisely. Something more conditional than that. Something that said, you are not the same man who left Caerveth yesterday morning. Pay attention to the difference. Somewhere in Essex, in a property no one had yet pinpointed, Seraphine was waiting, and a man named Piers Gault was going to lead them to her, whether he intended to or not. Piers' goal was not what Aldric had expected. He had built a version of the man in his mind during the walk to the gaming establishment. Something large and obviously dangerous, the kind of face that announced its intentions. What he found instead, watching from across a crowded and badly lit room that smelled of tallow and stale wine, was a man of perhaps 50, mid-height, with a neatly trimmed grey beard, and the unhurried manner of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He sat at a card table near the far wall and played with the comfortable concentration of a man who was not particularly interested in winning, only in being present. He spoke to the men around him occasionally, briefly, with the small, practiced smile of someone accustomed to rooms like this. He looked like someone's respectable uncle. Wolfe had positioned them at a table near the door with a clear sight line, and they had been there an hour. Nursing drinks, neither of them touched, and in that hour, Aldric had learned something about surveillance that no amount of authority or estate management had ever taught him. It required a particular quality of stillness. Not the stillness of patience. He knew that kind, had deployed it in negotiations and in long estate meetings that tested the endurance of everyone present. This was different. This was the stillness of erasure, of making yourself so unremarkable that the room's attention has simply moved around you. Wolfe had it naturally. Aldric was working at it with the grim focus of a man learning a new language by immersion. He's spoken to 3 people since we arrived, Wolfe said quietly, not looking at him, eyes still on the room. The man in the brown coat at the bar, twice, both brief. The woman near the fire. Once longer she passed him something small. The young man who came in 20 minutes ago and sat 2 tables away. I saw the woman, Aldric said. I missed the young man. He's a runner. Errand boy for someone higher. You can tell by the coat. Good quality, but slightly too large. Passed down or bought used. And he left immediately after speaking to Gault, which means he came with a message and left with an answer. A pause. Gault will move soon. How do you know? Because he's stopped playing seriously. He was counting cards earlier, very subtly, but counting. Now he's just going through the motions. He's waiting for a time to leave that won't draw notice. Aldric looked at the man across the room, with his respectable grey beard and his comfortable posture, and thought about Seraphine, being walked through a passage in the dark, sedated, on her own feet. He thought about his mother at 20 years old, making a bargain she could not undo. He thought about all of it and kept his face perfectly neutral. Galt left 40 minutes later, on foot, heading east. They followed at distance, Wolfe slightly ahead, adjusting pace with a fluency that Aldric matched as best he could. The streets were quieter now, the hour pushing toward the edge where even London's night commerce began to thin. Galt moved without apparent urgency, which was itself information. He was not running, not checking behind him, not behaving like a man who expected to be followed. Either he was very confident or very careless, and Aldric suspected it was confidence. He led them to the river, not the main embankment, a narrower access point, stone steps running down to the water where a small vessel was moored, unlit, with 2 men waiting beside it. Wolfe stopped Aldric with one hand on his arm, both of them pressed into the shadow of a warehouse wall, watching. Galt spoke to the waiting men briefly. One of them handed him something. Papers, from the look of it. Galt reviewed them in the thin available light, and then folded them and put them inside his coat. He said something else, too quiet to carry, and one of the men nodded. Then Galt turned, and for one moment he was facing their direction, and Aldric stopped breathing. But Galt's eyes moved across the darkness without catching, and he turned again and descended the steps toward the boat. "He's going to her," Aldric said, very low. "Yes," Wolfe said, "and we're going with him." What followed was something Aldric would think about afterward in fragments, rather than sequence, because it did not feel linear while it was happening. It felt like a series of held breaths. Wolfe had arranged, with a foresight that spoke to either extraordinary preparation or an uncomfortable familiarity with situations like this one, for a second vessel, smaller, a working riverboat, the kind that moved without attracting attention. It was waiting 50 yards upstream. They reached it without being seen, and the man Wolfe had hired to pilot. It knew the river well enough to follow at a distance through the dark, without lights. They went east. The city thinned around them as the river carried them, the dense press of buildings giving way to marshland and darkness, and the enormous quiet of the estuary. Aldric sat in the bow of the small boat and watched Galt's vessel ahead and felt, with each mile of river that passed beneath them, the particular sensation of approaching something that could not be undone. Whatever happened at the end of this water, the world would be different afterward. He knew this with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has learned to recognize turning points, even while still inside them. Wolfe sat beside him and said nothing, which was exactly right. The vessel ahead turned into a tributary. Theirs followed. And then, through the darkness and the marsh reeds, Aldric saw it. A property set back from the water, low and long, with light in 2 windows and the shapes of men outside who were not standing there casually. Guards. Wolfe put his hand on Aldric's arm again. "Listen to me now," he said quietly. "What I am going to tell you will be difficult to hear, and I need you to hear it anyway." Aldric looked at him. In the darkness, Wolfe's face was stripped of most of its usual careful architecture. He looked, for the first time, like a man who was not entirely certain of the outcome. "I have been in contact with the compact," Wolfe said. The silence was absolute. "Not as a member, as an intermediary. 3 years ago, when I began tracking them, I made myself useful to them in certain limited ways in order to stay close enough to understand their operations. I gave them nothing that hurt anyone. Information about rival groups, small navigational assistance, nothing with human cost. But I was useful to them, which means they know me, and they know I sometimes operate in a grey space." He held Aldric's gaze. "Which means I can walk through that door." "You lied to me," Aldric said. The words came out flat. "I didn't tell you the full picture. There's a difference, though I understand if the distinction feels thin from where you're sitting." "It does. A beat. Considerably thin. I know." And there it was, the thing in Wolfe's face that was adjacent to sorrow. Real, unguarded, fully present. "I did not tell you because I needed you to trust me long enough to get here. And I was not certain you would if you knew everything at once. That was a calculation I made about you. And I could have been wrong. And I'm telling you now because you deserve to know before we go in." Aldric breathed through the anger. Let it move through him without grabbing hold. Because underneath it, beneath the fury at being managed, was the knowledge that Wolfe was right. He would not have followed, not completely. Not with the trust the past 36 hours had required. And Seraphine was in that building. "What is your plan?" he said. Wolfe exhaled. "I go in first. I present myself as arriving with a message from a contact they trust. It buys us time and access. You follow through the side. There's a ground floor entry point, unguarded from what I can see, and you get to her while I have their attention." A pause. "But Aldric, there is a condition. The compact's representative inside, the one who has authority over this holding, is going to ask for something before they release her. A formal acknowledgement that the debt is recognized by a living Voss, by you. A written acknowledgement, a spoken one, witnessed. Legally meaningless, it won't hold in any court, but symbolically, for them, it matters. It means the account stays open. It means they retain the ability to call it again." Aldric was quiet for a moment. "In other words, I walk in and I confirm that my family still owes them, and then I take my sister and we leave, and the debt remains around our necks for however long. They decide to wait before calling it again." "Yes, and if I refuse?" Wolfe's jaw tightened. "They won't release her." The marsh was silent around them. The boat rocked very gently on black water. In the building ahead, 2 of the lighted windows were close together, and Aldric had been staring at them since Wolfe began speaking, thinking, "She is in there, behind one of those windows, or near them, alive and waiting." He thought about what it would mean to say yes. To walk in and acknowledge the debt and take his sister home and return to Kerveth with the knowledge that the compact's claim on his family had been spoken aloud and witnessed, and that it would come back, another generation perhaps. Another Seraphine, another innocent person, used as a reminder that the account was still open. He thought about his mother at 20, desperate and without options, reaching for the only hand extended to her. He thought about her at the dressing table, her face in the mirror, the things she had tried to tell him in the only way she knew how. He looked at Wolfe. "There is another way," Aldric said. Wolfe looked at him carefully. "Tell me." "I acknowledge the debt, formally witnessed, exactly as they want." And then I spend whatever it takes, whatever resources, whatever time, whatever is required, to find the full original terms of my mother's arrangement and prove, through whatever means exist in whatever world these people operate in, that it was satisfied, that she paid, that the account was closed and has been fraudulently reopened. He held Wolfe's gaze. You said yourself you don't know the full terms, which means they might not be able to prove them either. If the original contract was informal, if it was spoken, witnessed only by people who may no longer be living, then the debt exists only as long as both parties accept that it does. A long silence. That is an extraordinarily dangerous game, Wolfe said. Yes. It means giving them what they want tonight, and then fighting from the inside. It means getting Seraphine out tonight, and then refusing to let this follow us for another generation. He felt the decision settle in him, like something that had been waiting a long time to be made. I am not my mother. I don't disappear from things that frighten me. And I am not leaving that building tonight without ending this permanently, one way or another. Wolfe looked at him across the dark water for a long moment, and the something in his pale eyes was not sorrow now. It was something more like recognition. All right, he said quietly. Then we go in together. They went in through the side. Wolfe went first through the main entrance, and Aldric counted 60 seconds in the dark beside the building's outer wall, listening to the marsh and his own breathing, before he moved to the ground floor entry point. Wolfe had identified from the water. It was a service door, old wood, the latch worn loose with age. It opened without sound. He slipped inside and stood still in the darkness of a narrow corridor that smelled of damp stone and lamp oil, and he listened, voices ahead. Wolfe's, low and unhurried, doing the thing it did, filling a room with just enough to hold attention without, revealing anything, and another voice, older, the representative. Aldric moved toward it, and then away from it, deeper into the building, because Seraphine was not where the voices were. He found her in the third room he tried. She was sitting upright on a narrow cot against the far wall, wrapped in a blanket that was not hers, and when the door opened, she was on her feet before he was fully through it. Already positioned, already braced, with the particular readiness of someone who had been waiting for a threat, and had decided, somewhere in the hours of waiting, that she would not meet it sitting down. She had their mother's dark eyes, and she had her brother's jaw, and she was, in that moment, one of the most remarkable things Aldric had ever seen. She saw him, her face did something complicated and swift, that moved through relief and fury, and tears in approximately 2 seconds. And then she crossed the room, and he held her. And neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was too much, and none of it was ready yet. You look terrible, she said into his shoulder, which was so precisely what Wolfe had said to him 2 days ago that he almost made a sound that was not entirely appropriate to the moment. Later, he said quietly, we have to move. She pulled back and looked at him with the clear, assessing eyes of someone who had not spent the past 2 days falling apart and intended for him to know it. There are 4 men in this building, 2 outside, 1 in the main room, 1 who checks this corridor every 30 minutes. She paused. He was here 12 minutes ago. Aldric stared at her. How do you know that? I counted. And the 1 in the main room has a bad knee. You can hear him on the floorboards. A beat. I was not going to simply sit here, Aldric. He took her hand and they went. The corridor was clear. The building was doing what buildings do when attention is directed elsewhere, settling, breathing, giving them its seams and its shadows. He could still hear Wolfe's voice from the main room, unhurried, occupying the space. They reached the service door, and the cold night air came in through the gap. And then they were outside in the marsh dark, with the water ahead, and the boat waiting where they had left it. He did not breathe properly until they were on the water. Seraphine sat across from him in the bow, still wrapped in the blanket that was not hers, watching the building recede behind them, with the expression of someone filing information away for future use. She was pale, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke to days of disrupted sleep. But she was whole, and she was thinking, and the relief of that was so large that Aldric had to look away from her for a moment. At the passing dark of the riverbank, Wolfe appeared at the water's edge 7 minutes after they boarded, walking without hurry, and stepped into the boat with the unhurried ease of a man, concluding a business call rather than extracting himself from a den of dangerous people. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at him. Something passed between them that Aldric could not quite read. A mutual assessment, rapid and thorough. "You must be Wolfe," Seraphine said. "And you must be the reason we've had an interesting few days," he said. She almost smiled. Was the acknowledgement. Witnessed. Aldric looked at her sharply. She met his gaze with the particular expression she had always worn when she wanted him to know she was not as uninformed as he assumed. "I heard them talking," she said simply, "the night they brought me. They were not as careful as they thought." "It was witnessed," Aldric said, "by their representative and one other." She nodded slowly, processing it. "And now we go home, and then we start pulling it apart." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her weighing it. The spoken debt, the open account, the shape of the thing they were carrying back with them. She had their mother's instinct for reading the full weight of a situation, not just its surface. He had always known this about her. He had perhaps, in the management and the protection of the past 12 years, occasionally forgotten to account for it. "All right," she said quietly, and then, after a moment, "Tell me about Mother." The river carried them west, back toward the city, back toward the ordinary world that had continued its business while all of this was happening. Aldric told her, not everything, not yet, not on a cold boat in the dark, with the shock still sitting in her body, but enough. The marking on the windowsill, Fenwick's careful half-explanation, what Wolfe had told him in the room in Southwark. Their mother, at 20 years old, desperate and without options, reaching for the only hand extended to her. Seraphine listened without interrupting, which was not her natural inclination. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, watching the water. "She never told us because she was ashamed," she said finally. "Not a question. I think she was afraid," Aldric said. "I think shame and fear had become the same thing for her over time." Another silence. "She should have told you." "Yes, but I understand why she didn't." She looked at him, and her eyes were very steady. "You would have tried to fix it immediately. You would have gone after it with both hands and no map, and probably made it considerably worse." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Wolfe, who was studying the riverbank, with the intense interest of a man who was absolutely not listening to this conversation. "That is not entirely inaccurate," Aldric said. They reached London before dawn and parted briefly. Seraphine taken to the inn, where Aldric's driver was lodged, washed and fed, and given a room, refusing the physician that was offered with a decisiveness that suggested she was going to be fine. Aldric stood in the inn's narrow hallway afterward and felt the past 2 days settle on him all at once. The full accumulated weight of the sleeplessness and the fear and the river and the dark building in the marsh, and he put one hand on the wall for a moment and simply stood there. Wolfe appeared from the staircase and stopped when he saw him. "Sit down before you fall down," he said. "I'm not going to fall down. Coveth." Aldric sat down, on the hallway bench, which was not comfortable, and was probably not intended for a duke in an expensive coat, and he sat there with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he looked at the floor for a moment. "The representative," he said. He agreed too easily to releasing her once the acknowledgement was made. It was too clean. "Yes," Wolfe said, sitting beside him. "I noticed that, which means the acknowledgement was more important to them than the holding. They wanted the account on record. Seraphine was the means, not the end. What they needed was a living Voss saying the debt exists." He paused, which tells us the original terms are in dispute somewhere, internally, within the compact. Someone questions whether the debt is valid. The acknowledgement tonight was for that someone, proof of claim, witnessed, usable. Aldric absorbed this. So by giving them what they asked for, I handed them ammunition in an internal argument. Possibly. Or you handed them something they'll find impossible to enforce, because the original terms are as thin as you suspected. He was quiet for a moment. "There's someone inside the compact who doesn't want this debt called. That's useful to us. Can you find them?" "I can try." Aldric looked at him sideways. "You knew the representative. We've spoken before. He let you walk out. He let all 3 of us walk out. That is not purely because you presented yourself well." Wolfe was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't. What did you give them?" A pause that was not quite comfortable. "I told him I would bring you in voluntarily, that you would speak the acknowledgement without coercion, that it would be cleaner and more legitimate than anything they could extract through continued pressure." He looked at Aldric steadily. "I didn't tell you because you would have argued about it on the boat when we needed to be moving. You traded my cooperation for her release. I told the truth about what you were going to do anyway, yes. A beat. You were always going to acknowledge it. You made that decision on the water. I simply made it worth something to them in advance." Aldric thought about being angry. He was too tired, and underneath the tiredness was the knowledge that Wolfe was not wrong. He had made the decision. He had walked in and spoken it clearly, and he would make the same decision again, because Seraphine was upstairs in a room with a fire and a plate of food and all of her own thoughts intact. "You are a very difficult man to trust," Aldric said. "I know. And yet," Wolfe looked at him. "And yet," he agreed quietly. Something settled between them in the silence that followed. Not comfort. It was too early and too complicated for comfort. But something more durable than that. The kind of thing that gets built in the specific conditions of shared danger and chosen honesty, that does not need to be named to be real. They returned to Cerveth 3 days later. Seraphine slept most of the journey and woke sharp-eyed and already planning, asking questions about the compact's structure, about what Aldric knew of their mother's original circumstances, about what avenues existed, for contesting a debt whose terms were potentially unprovable. She had been stolen away in the night and held for days, and she was using the return journey to build a case. Aldric watched her across the carriage and felt something he could not quite name. Pride. Yes, and a particular kind of love that had always existed between them, but had been clarified somehow, sharpened by the past week into something more deliberate. He had spent 12 years protecting her from weight. She was more than capable of carrying. He would not make that mistake again. Fenwick met them at the door with the expression of a man who had not slept much either, and was not going to say so. He looked at Seraphine for a long moment, and something moved through his careful face that was unguarded enough to be real. She embraced him briefly, which clearly surprised him, and then she went inside, and Fenwick looked at Aldric. "And Wolfe," he said, because Wolfe had come too, standing slightly apart on the gravel, in the way he had of occupying space without demanding acknowledgement of it. "He stays," Aldric said. "For now." Fenwick absorbed this without visible reaction, which was its own form of reaction. He nodded once and went inside, and Aldric stood for a moment on the steps of Cerveth in the cold autumn light, looking at the grounds, the moors beyond, the house that had been his responsibility since he was 19 years old. He had left here 2 days ago, believing he understood the ground he stood on. He had come back knowing he did not, knowing the ground was older than he had thought, and stranger, and riddled with things his mother had buried, because she did not know how to carry them in the open. He had come back with a sister who had counted guards from a comte in a dark room, and a debt acknowledged, and a fight ahead that would require patience and precision, and the willingness to move through a world he was only beginning to learn. He had also come back with something he had not left with. Wolfe came to stand beside him, looking at the house. "Your mother loved this place," he said. "She told me that. She said she had never belonged anywhere before it." Aldric was quiet for a moment, and yet she could never tell it the truth about herself. "People rarely tell the truth to the places they love most," Wolfe said. "Too much to lose." The wind moved across the moors, and the house stood in it, as it had stood for 100 years, indifferent to the complications of the people it sheltered, unchanged by what had happened and what was coming. Aldric looked at it and thought about his mother, young and frightened, and reaching for help from the wrong hands, and he thought about Seraphine inside, already moving toward the next thing, and he thought about debts, and the people who call them, and the difference between running from a thing and turning to face it with your eyes open. He thought about what his mother had said at the dressing table 19 years ago, and understood it now in a way he had not then. There are debts, Aldric, that outlive the people who made them. She had not been warning him that debts were inescapable. She had been telling him they were inherited, that they came down through families, not because they had to, but because no one had ever stopped long enough to refuse them. He was refusing. He went inside, and the door closed behind him, and Cerveth stood in the autumn wind and held all of them, the living and the weight of the dead, and the complicated, unfinished, necessary work of what came next.